The key turned in the lock at 9:30, the way it had turned every night for 3 weeks, and Eleanor Vane stood very still in the middle of the east wing and listened to her husband walk away. She did not move until the sound of his boots had faded down the gallery, and the great house had folded its silence back over her. The candle on the writing desk guttered in a draught she could not find the source of. Outside the tall windows the autumn rain came down in long gray threads against the glass, and the lawns of Renmore ran away into a darkness she was no longer permitted to cross. She had been the Countess of Renmore for 11 months. She had been a prisoner in her own marriage for 3 weeks. To the servants below stairs, she was already something to be spoken of in the past tense, a lady gone, strange and shut away, and to the county she would soon be nothing at all. She set her hand flat against the cold panel of the door, and did not weep because weeping had stopped helping her some days before, and because there was a thing she knew that her husband did not. She had not told him. She had thought at first that she would not need to. If you have ever stood on the wrong side of a locked door in a house that was supposed to be your own, you will understand the particular stillness that came over her then. Stay with her a while. Her story does not end where the lock suggests it does. Wall. The marriage had been arranged in the cold, practical manner of such things, a settlement between her late father's debts and the Earl's want of an heir, and Eleanor had walked into it with her eyes open, and her hopes folded small. Julian Vane, the Earl of Renmore, had been 34 and silent when she met him, a tall man, with a jaw like carved stone and eyes the color of smoke over a winter field. He had not pretended to love her. He had been unfailingly correct, which was its own kind of cold, and he had given her the run of his house and a generous allowance and almost nothing of himself. For the better part of a year they had lived as courteous strangers under one roof, meeting at dinner, parting at the foot of the stairs, and Eleanor had told herself that courtesy was more than many women got, and that she would learn to be content with it. She had not learned to be content. That was the first truth she had hidden from him. The second was the passage. She had found it in her 3rd month at Renmore, on an afternoon when the rain had kept her indoors and curiosity had carried her into the oldest part of the house. The east wing had been built in the time of the first Earl, 200 years before, when great families still feared their neighbors, and built accordingly, and behind the carved paneling of what was now her sitting room, there ran a narrow servant's stair that the later renovations had sealed and plastered and forgotten. Eleanor had pressed a warp section of wainscot by accident and felt it give. Behind it, black and close and smelling of cold stone, a stair went down inside the thickness of the wall, down past the floor below, and came out at last behind a tapestry in the disused chapel passage near the south door. She had told no one. She had not even known then. Why she kept it secret, she knew now. The county had a name for what she was becoming, and the county was seldom kind. At the harvest assembly in September, before everything turned, she had heard Lady Pruitt say it behind a painted fan, low and certain, to a circle of women who did not trouble to lower their own voices. The poor creature has no more sense than her mother had, and we all know how that ended. The words had found Eleanor across the width of a crowded room the way such words always do, and she had kept her face smooth and her spine straight, and had not given them the satisfaction of a flinch. Yet she had heard. A woman in her position was always permitted to hear. What had turned the Earl from cold courtesy to the turning of a key was a thing Eleanor did not yet fully understand, and the not understanding was the worst of it. She turned it over in the long evenings, the way one worries a loose tooth. It had begun in the last week of September, after the physician's visit she had not been told the purpose of, after she had come upon her husband in the long gallery, standing before the covered portrait that hung at the gallery's end, and had asked him quietly whose likeness it was. He had not answered. He had looked at her as though she had struck him, and the next morning the first of the new rules had arrived by way of his steward, and within the fortnight she was kept to the east wing, with a maid to bring her meals and a locked door between herself and the rest of her life. She lit a second candle from the first, and carried it to the window seat, and sat with her knees drawn up like a girl, and she made herself think clearly. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had wronged no one. She had broken no vow, spent no fortune, shamed no name. Whatever Julian believed of her, it was a thing built in his own mind out of materials she had never handed him, and a thing built so could perhaps be unbuilt if only she could discover what it was made of. She could leave. That was the plainest fact, and the most dangerous. The passage behind the wainscot would carry her out of the house any night she chose, down through the dark, and out the south door, into the grounds, and from there, the road, and from there, anywhere at all. A woman who fled her husband's house in the night would be ruined past saving, but she was already more than half ruined in the county's eyes. And ruin with her freedom intact was a different country than ruin in a locked room. She had thought about it every night for 3 weeks. She had not gone. She told herself it was prudence. It was not entirely prudence. The truth, the third truth, and the hardest, was that somewhere in the long, courteous year she had come to love the cold man who had locked her in, and she could not yet make herself believe that the man she had watched was capable of the cruelty the locked door named. She had watched him more closely than he knew. She had seen him stop to write, a fallen fledgling on the terrace steps, when he believed himself unobserved. She had seen the way his hand went, sometimes to the breast of his coat, as though to confirm that something small and folded still rested there. She had heard him once through a half-open study door, speaking very low to no one she could see. And the word he had spoken had been a name, and the name had not been hers. Eleanor blew out one candle to save it, and sat in the smaller light, and she made her decision, which was not the decision to flee. She would use the passage, yes, though not to leave. She would use it to learn. The first night she went down was the 3rd night of October, and her own heartbeat was so loud in the close dark of the stair that she had to stop on the landing and press her palm to her chest and wait for it to quiet. The stone was cold. Through her slippers, cobwebs touched her face, like the fingers of the dead, and she did not cry out, because crying out was the one thing the dark would not forgive. The air grew colder as she descended, and older, a still cold that had not been breathed by anyone in 100 years, and it carried the mineral smell of wet stone and the dry smell of dust that no broom had ever reached. Her shoulder brushed the wall and came away gray. Somewhere below her a drop of water fell, and fell again, marking a slow, patient time of its own, and she counted the falls to keep her courage steady and lost count at 40, and began again. She came out behind the tapestry into the chapel passage, and stood listening, and the house at night was a different animal than the house by day, all settling timber and distant clocks, and she moved through it like a guest in her own memory. She did not know, that first night, what she was looking for. She knew only that the answer lived somewhere in the part of the house she had been shut out of, and that the covered portrait, at the end of the long gallery, was where the trouble had begun. She climbed the main stair on stocking feet with her slippers in her hand. And she went to the gallery, and she stood before the portrait in its shroud of Holland cloth, and after a long moment she lifted the corner of the cloth and looked. A young woman looked back at her out of the canvas, fair and laughing, perhaps 22, painted in the dress of 6 or 7 years before, with a child of about a year held in the curve of her arm. The brass plate beneath the frame, when Eleanor brought the candle close, read in small engraved letters the name she had heard him speak through the study door. Cecily, Countess of Renmore, and below it 2 dates, and the second of the dates was a little more than 2 years past. Eleanor stood very still in the gallery in the dark, and felt the shape of the thing settle into place. He had been married before. There had been a child. They were both, by the evidence of the second date and the empty nursery she had never been shown, gone. And she, the second wife, the arranged and convenient wife, had walked into the long gallery one September afternoon and asked him, in all innocence, whose likeness it was, and had watched a wound she knew nothing of tear open behind his eyes. She let the cloth fall back over the painted face, She did not have the whole of it. She had the beginning of it, however, and the beginning was grief, not cruelty. And the difference was the difference between a wall and a door. She went down the dark stair again before the house woke, and she lay in her bed in the east wing as the gray came up over the wet lawns, and she did not sleep. She had been locked away by a grieving man who had mistaken her for something she was not. She did not yet know what. She meant to find out, all the same. And she had a passage she had forgotten, and for the first time in 3 weeks she was not afraid. The second night she learned more, and what she learned she did not want. She had gone down again, surer of her footing now, and she had heard voices in the small hours coming from the library, where no one should have been, and she had crept along the gallery above, and looked down through the carved balustrade into the lamplit room below. Her husband stood at the cold hearth with his back to her. Before him, in a traveling coat, still wet at the shoulders, stood a man Eleanor knew by sight, and disliked by instinct. Mr. Shoddy Crane, the Earl's man of business, a smooth, grey person who smiled with the lower half of his face only. She would have withdrawn. She had no wish to play the eavesdropper on her husband's affairs. Then Mr. Candidel. Crane said her name, and a person will stay to hear her own name spoken in a room she has been shut out of. And so Eleanor stayed, and held her breath, and listened. "The physician is quite firm upon the point," Crane was saying, in the patient tone of a man laying out a hand of cards he has already won. "The lady's mother died mad, my lord. Raving, by all accounts, and confined her last years. These things run in the blood. The signs are unmistakable to a trained eye. The wandering, the secrecy, the night hours. We have caught her ourselves upon the stairs at unaccountable times. You did the kind thing in confining her gently to the east wing. The next kind thing, the lawful thing, is the certificate and the private establishment near York, where she will be looked after by people who understand such cases, and where she can do no harm to herself, nor to the name." Eleanor pressed her hand hard over her own mouth. She understood now, all at once and entirely, the whole cold machinery of it. Her father's debts had bought her this marriage. Her mother's long, sad illness, which had been melancholy, and not madness, which Eleanor had nursed with her own hands and never spoken of, had been dug up and dressed in a borrowed coat of lunacy. And the locked door, which she had told herself was grief, was being built into a case. A wife declared mad could be put away. A wife put away left her husband neither widower nor cuckold but free, and her settlement and the house her father's money had bought stayed precisely where they were. She waited for her husband to laugh in the man's face. She waited for him to say that his wife was no more mad than he was, that he had locked the east wing for reasons of his own grief, and would not have her slandered. He did not laugh. He stood at the cold hearth, with his back to her, and his shoulders set, like a man bearing a great weight. And he said, the level voice she knew, "I will not sign anything tonight." And Mr. Graal. Crane smiled with the lower half of his face and bowed, and said that of course there was no hurry. "My lord, none in the world. Only the sooner settled, the kinder." And he gathered his wet coat and went out. And Eleanor went back up the dark stair, with her heart gone to ice. He had not signed. She held to that through the rest of the sleepless night, the way a drowning woman holds to a spar. He had not signed, and he had not laughed, and a man who is certain of a thing does neither. Neither, though, had he defended her, and the establishment near York was a real place with real walls, and she understood now that the passage behind the wainscot was no longer a curiosity. It was the only road she had, and the door at the end of it had a name, and the name was York, and she would walk down that dark stair and out into the rain before she would be walked through any other. And yet she did not go. She lay in the cold grey light and turned it over once more, because she was, whatever the county and Mr. Crane might say, a woman of considerable sense, and sense told her that flight was confession. If she ran, she proved the wandering, proved the night hours, proved every word the smooth gray man had spoken. The certificate would follow her down every road in England. There was only one way out of the trap that did not spring it shut behind her, and that was to make the truth visible to the one man whose word could undo Crane's, and that man was her own husband, who would not look at her. So she would make him look, not with words through a locked door, with the truth itself. Laid where he could not help but see it, she began the next day, in daylight, within her permitted rooms, by writing everything down. She wrote out the whole long history of her mother's illness, in her own clear hand, the physicians who had attended, the nature of the melancholy, the particular griefs that had brought it on, the dates, the witnesses, still living who could speak to it. She wrote it not as a plea, but as a deposition, plain and exact, the way her father had taught her to keep accounts. It took her 3 days. And on the 4th night, she carried it down the dark stair, not to flee, but to leave it where her husband would find it, in the one place in the house. She was certain he still went. She had marked, in her long watching, that the covered portrait was visited. The holland cloth, when she had first lifted it, had been disturbed at one corner by a hand that was not hers. He came to it in the night. She was nearly sure as she did. 2 grievers passing in the same dark, and never meeting. So she folded her deposition small, and she tucked it behind the brass plate of the portrait, where the name Cecily was, so that any hand that lifted the cloth must dislodge it, and she went back up the stair, and she waited. For 2 nights, nothing came of it. On the 3rd, the maid who brought her breakfast, a frightened girl named Tilly, who had been kind to her in small ways, set down the tray with shaking hands and would not meet her eye, and Eleanor knew that something below had shifted. At noon a footman came, and not the steward, and unlocked the door of the east wing and left it standing open, and said, his eyes carefully on the wall above her head, that his lordship requested the favor of the countess's company in the long gallery. She went. She had dressed with great care in her plainest gown, the soft gray one with no ornament, because she would not go to this meeting tricked out like a woman pleading for her life. She walked the length of the house she had been shut out of for a month, past servants who pressed themselves to the walls and looked at her as one looks at the returned dead, and she came into the long gallery where the autumn light fell gray and even through the tall windows, and her husband stood at the gallery's end before the portrait, which he had uncovered. He turned when she came in. She had not seen his face in daylight in a month, and the change in it stopped her 3 paces off. He had grown thin. There was gray at his temples that she did not remember, and his eyes, when they found hers, were not cold at all, but raw, scraped down to something she had never been permitted to see. In his hand, unfolded, was her deposition. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The rain had stopped in the night, and the wet lawns beyond the glass were very bright, and the house was utterly silent around them, and Eleanor stood in her plain gray gown, with her hands quiet at her sides, and waited, because she had said everything she had to say on the paper in his hand, and the next word was his to speak. "You came down by the old stair," he said at last. It was not a question. His voice was low and not quite steady, the one behind the wainscot in the sitting room. "I had forgotten it was there. My grandfather had it sealed when I was a boy." He looked at the paper, and then at her, and then at the painted woman on the wall. "You could have gone. Any night this month, you could have walked out of this house and been gone. And instead you went down into the dark, and you climbed back up and you left this where I would find it." He stopped, his jaw worked. "Why did you not go?" Eleanor found that her own voice, when it came, was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Because going would have proved them right," she said, "and because the man who locked that door is not, I think, the man Mr. Preda. Crane believes he is bargaining with." He flinched at the name. He set the deposition down very carefully on the small table beneath the portrait, as though it were something that might break, and he was silent so long that she thought he would not answer at all. When he spoke again, it was not to defend himself, and not to accuse her. It was to tell her the truth, which she understood, even in the moment, was a thing he had told no living person, Her name was Cecily. He said, "She was my wife. The child was our son, Thomas. They both took the fever in the autumn 2 years ago, within a week of one another. And I was in London, and by the time I reached home they were 3 days buried." He stopped. The whole of it came out of him slowly and without color, the way a man recites a thing he has said to himself 10,000 times in the dark. I had been kept from home by business that I had told myself could not wait. It could have waited. I have not been able to forgive the man who let it wait, and that man and I share a face. He looked at her then directly. When my aunt and Crane between them arranged this second marriage, I agreed to it as one agrees to a sentence. I did not mean to harm you. I meant only to keep so far from you that I could never again be the cause of a thing like that. And then you asked me, in this gallery, whose likeness it was, and I could not breathe, and I let them persuade me that the kindest thing, the safest thing, was to keep you apart from me. He gestured at the room, at the locked month, at all of it. I told myself it was for your protection. He shook his head once slowly. It was for mine. Eleanor crossed the gallery to him. She did not run. She crossed the gray light, one quiet step at a time, until she stood close enough to see that his eyes were wet. And she did a thing she had wanted to do for the better part of a year and had never been permitted. She lifted her hand and laid it flat against the breast of his coat, over the place where she had so often seen his own hand go. And beneath her palm she felt the stiff, small shape of what was folded there. A letter, or a lock of hair, or a child's drawing, she never asked. And she felt under that the hard, quick knock of his heart. "You were not the fever," she said. "You were in London. You were a man doing an unkind, ordinary thing that 1,000 men do every day. And the world broke behind your back, and that is the cruelest accident there is. But it is an accident, and it is not the same as guilt, and you have served a sentence for it that no court would ever have passed." She felt his heart strike against her hand. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "I never was. I have only been afraid of dying in a locked room with my name." A lie. His hand came up and closed over hers where it lay against his coat, and he bowed his head until his brow rested against her hair. And for a long while the Earl of Renmore stood in the gray light and shook, very quietly, the way the strong shake when a thing they have carried alone is at last set down. Eleanor stood and held the warmth of him and did not move, and the painted woman on the wall looked down at the two of them with her laughing eyes and her year-old child. And Eleanor found to her own surprise that she felt no jealousy of the dead, only a great tenderness and a fierce new resolve. She had not been brought into this house to replace anyone. She had been brought to be buried in it. She did not intend to be. "There is more," she said, drawing back to look up at him. "You have not signed the certificate, Mr. Great. Crane, however, means to have it signed, with you or without. Your willing hand, and a man who would dress my mother's grief in the coat of madness, will not stop at one refusal. We have a little time. We must not waste it." She felt him gather himself. She watched the rawness in his face draw back behind something harder and more useful, and for the first time she saw the man who held the title, and not only the man the title had broken. "Tell me what you know," he said. "All of it." And she did. Over the days that followed, they became, the two of them, a thing the house had not contained in years, which was a partnership. The locked door stood open. Eleanor moved back into the rooms that were rightfully hers, and if the servants whispered now, it was a different kind of whisper, and the kind maid Tilly walked with her head a little higher. They did not make the change public, not yet, because Eleanor had understood a thing that her husband, in his grief, had not. Mr. Crane did not yet know that his case had collapsed. And a danger that believes itself still hidden is a danger that can be caught in the open. She learned through patient questions, to the older servants, and through the estate's own papers, which Julian now laid open to her without reserve, that Mr. Megg, Crane's interest in the matter near York was not the disinterested kindness he professed. The private establishment was owned through 2 intervening names by Crane's own brother. A wife confined there at the Earl's expense was a fee paid quarterly into the family's pocket for as long as she lived, and a wife who could be made to seem mad enough to need confining was a steady annuity. Worse, Eleanor found, going back through the ledgers, with the cold attention her father had taught her, that the same hand had been at work before. The physician's bills for the late Countess's last illness had passed through Crane, and there were sums in them that answered to no medicine, and a pattern of small steady thefts ran back through the accounts for years, hidden in the grief of a house too broken to count its own money. The man had been bleeding Renmore quietly since before Cecily died. Eleanor's confinement was only the largest and the boldest of his schemes, the one that would have set him up for life. This, she told her husband, is what we lay before the magistrate. Not my sanity, his thefts. A man cannot at once be believed about a wife's madness, and disbelieved about everything he has touched. We do not defend me. We expose him, and my freedom falls out of it, of its own weight. Julian looked at her across the study table with the ledger spread between them, and something in his face that had not been there before, a kind of grave wonder, and he said, his voice low, "I was given to understand I had married a liability." He shook his head slowly. "I find I have married the cleverest person at Renmore, and I have spent a year too frightened to discover it." Eleanor felt the warmth climb her throat and did not look away. It was not a declaration. It was better than a declaration. It was a man seeing her plainly in daylight, with the door open, and finding the truth of her more than he had dared hope. They sprang it 3 weeks later, and they sprang it in company, because Eleanor judged rightly that a man like Crane would never confess in a quiet room but might break in a public one. The occasion was the Michaelmas dinner that the Earls of Renmore had given for the county since before anyone living could remember, a long table set for 30, in the great dining room with its blaze of candles and its old silver. And Eleanor, who had not appeared in society in 2 months, came down the great stair on her husband's arm in a gown of deep green that he had ordered for her from London, and walked into a room that fell silent at the sight of her. Lady Pruitt was there, fan and all. So was Mr. Bocce. Crane seated in the place of trust near the head of the table, his smooth gray face arranged in its half-smile, certain still that the mad Countess was safely shelved and that this appearance was some last courtesy before the establishment near York. Eleanor was placed at her husband's right hand, where the Countess belonged. She ate little. She spoke pleasantly to her neighbors. She waited, as she had waited on the dark stair, for the moment to be exactly right, and when the covers had been drawn and the wine was going round and the whole table was attending to its own comfort, the Earl of Renmore rose to his feet with a paper in his hand, and the room quieted to hear what was surely to be the usual gracious toast.
"It was not."
He thanked them for coming, and then, in the level voice that carried to the far end of the table without his ever raising it, he said that before the evening went further, he owed the county a correction, for it had lately been whispered that his Countess was unwell in her mind, and he wished it known, here among the people whose good opinion he valued, that there was not one word of truth in it, and that the whisper had a source, and that the source was sitting at his table. Mr. Crane's half-smile did not at first understand that it was over. Eleanor watched it falter only when the Earl laid the first of the papers on the cloth, and named the establishment near York, and named the brother who owned it, and named the quarterly fee, and went on, in the same unhurried voice, through the physician's padded bills and the sums that answered to no medicine, and the long, quiet theft running back 7 years through the accounts of a house too grieved to look. The table had gone entirely still. Lady Pruitt's fan hung forgotten, and Mr. Pashley. Crane rose halfway from his chair with his mouth working and got out the word slander before the Earl set down the last ledger and said, not loudly, "The magistrate is Sir Henry Gosse, who sits at my left hand this evening, and who has had copies of all of it since noon. You may make your defense to him." The smooth gray man looked down the long bright table and saw 30 faces turned to him, and not one of them friendly, and the half-smile came apart entirely, and what was under it was not cleverness at all, but a small and frightened greed, and he sat back down because his legs would not hold him. It was over as quietly as that. There was no shouting. The magistrate folded his napkin, and Rose and two of the Earl's men came in from the hall where they had been waiting. And Mr. Dosset. Crane was taken out of the great dining room between them, past the silver and the candles, and the county watched him go in a silence that was its own verdict. Eleanor did not gloat. She sat very straight in her green gown at her husband's right hand, and she felt the table's regard turn to her, and turn, as the county's regard always did, with the wind. But she took no triumph in it. She had not done this to be admired by people who had let her be slandered. She had done it to walk free in her own house, in daylight. When at last the dinner gathered itself and broke up, and the carriages were called, Lady Pruitt approached her in the hall with her fan lowered, and something almost like respect in her hard old face, and began to say a thing that might have been an apology, and Eleanor met her with perfect courtesy, and let her say it, and gave her nothing more. Which was the only revenge she ever took, and the only one she wanted. When the last carriage had gone and the great house was quiet again, but quiet in the warm way now and not the locked way, Eleanor found her husband in the long gallery before the portrait of Cicely and the child. He had not covered it again. He had had a small lamp set before it, and the painted woman's laughing face was warm in the light, and he stood looking up at her with no grief in his face now, or none that was only grief, but the settled sorrow of a man who has at last laid his dead to rest in their proper place and means to go on living. She loved you, Eleanor said, coming to stand beside him, and the boy. I am glad you keep her here, in the light, where you can see her. I keep her in the light, he said, because for 2 years I kept her in the dark behind a cloth. And that was the lie. He turned from the portrait to his wife. The truth is that I loved them and lost them, and it was not my doing, and the truth is also that I am alive, and you are alive, and I have wasted nearly a year of a marriage I did not choose, and have come, against every expectation, to want with my whole heart. He took her hand, the same hand she had laid against his coat in this gallery weeks before. I will not lock a door in this house again as long as I live, he said. I had rather you walked out of every one of them by your own choosing and came back, than that I kept you by any other means. Eleanor stood in the lamplight with her hand in his, and felt the last of the cold go out of the year. I am not going to walk out, she said. I went down that stair every night for a month, and climbed back up every morning, and I think I have proved which way I mean to go. That winter the first hard snow came early, and on the night it fell Eleanor and Julian sat together by the fire in the small sitting room of the east wing, which she had asked to keep, not as a prison now but as her own, because she had been happy learning to be brave in it. The warped section of wainscot she had left exactly as it was. He had wanted to have it sealed, properly at last, and she had asked him not to, and he had not understood until she told him that she liked knowing the way was there, that a door one chooses not to use is a different thing entirely from a door one cannot. He had laughed at that, the brief, rare laugh she had heard perhaps 3 times, and had let it be. The snow came down past the tall windows in the firelight, slow and white and silent, and somewhere below a clock told the half-hour, and Eleanor leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt his arm come around her without hesitation, the way it had learned to in the warm new weeks. The fire threw a low gold light across the room and made small shifting shapes on the ceiling, and the logs settled now and then with a soft collapse and a brief rush of sparks up the chimney. On the hearthrug lay a book she had been reading aloud to him before the snow had drawn them both to the window, left open at the page, and the tea had gone cold in the pot, and neither of them had risen to mend it, because there was nowhere in the world either of them wished to be, but exactly here. On the table beside them lay her deposition, the long, careful account of her mother's grief, which he had asked to keep, and had folded now into the same breast pocket where the older folded thing still rested, so that the two of them, the living wife and the dead, were carried together over his heart, and Eleanor found she did not mind it in the least. She thought of the dark stair behind the wall, sealed in the minds of everyone but the two of them. The passage she had forgotten and she had found, the road she had refused to take alone and would now never need. She thought that a marriage was perhaps a thing like that, a house with more rooms and more passages than either party knew at the start. Some of them locked by fear, and some forgotten by grief, and that the whole long work of it was the patient finding of the way from one shut chamber to another, until at last the house stood open to itself. Lamp lit in every window, no door barred against the night. The fire settled, the snow went on falling, kind and slow, over the wide white lawns of Renmore that she could cross now whenever she chose. Julian turned his head and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she closed her eyes, and the house held them both in its warmth, and the candle she had once lit alone in a locked room burned now on the mantel between them, steady, unguttering, with no draught in all the house to trouble it. If Eleanor's long climb up that dark stair stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the warm room with her before you go. Some doors, the kindest ones, are the ones we learn we never have to use.